Welcome back to Pokemon Episode Summaries. Today, I'll be doing episode 262, A Crowning Achievement. The episode begins with Ash and the gang continuing on their way to Mount Silver, as Larvitar still slept in Ash's backpack, only to be woken up by Misty trying to get his attention. As she was complaining about Larvitar always sleeping, stating that she thought that Ash slept a lot, but she was proven wrong with how much Larvitar slept. Misty saying this obviously didn't make Larvitar warm up to her, as it hardened in fear. This led Ash to criticize Misty for her rudeness to Larvitar, and told Larvitar to not waste its energy hardening, just because Misty was being rude to it, explaining that Misty was rude all the time, so if it was going to constantly harden whenever Misty was rude, it would lose out on a whole bunch of its energy. Misty claimed that she wasn't trying to be rude to Larvitar, she was just making an observation on how much it slept, and admitted to Larvitar that they had started off on the wrong foot, and she simply greeted it with a good morning. However, Larvitar was still frightened by Misty, leading Misty to get frustrated, stating that she wanted Larvitar to get used to her and she wanted to truly make friends with it, but she just fucking couldn't because all Larvitar seemed to care about was Ash. Brock rebutted, though, that Larvitar simply just didn't like Misty, stating that he was sure he could get Larvitar to like him, since he was going to be the world's best Pokemon breeder after all, at least according to him. So, he decided to prove that Larvitar could like him by making him happy again, by making some funny faces towards him, like sticking his tongue out and pulling his eyes down, in an attempt to make it laugh, but Larvitar was actually immensely terrified by Brock's faces, to the point where it started to screech, forcing Ash and the gang to cover up their ears. Ash, being the one person that Larvitar for sure seemed to like, was able to calm Larvitar down and stop the screeching, as Misty made fun of how terrifying Brock's faces were, although Brock rebutted that they weren't fucking meant to be terrifying, they always made Pokemon laugh, and he didn't understand why it didn't work on Larvitar. After all of this immense screaming that Ash and the gang were victim to, they were immensely hungry, so they wanted to have some lunch. Suddenly, Brock heard a river nearby, specifically the waterfall, and suggests that Ash and the gang go there for lunch, stating that if Ash and the gang took Larvitar to see something as beautiful as a waterfall, it might start liking all of them and calm down fully from now on, because the waterfall was so peaceful. Ash and Misty liked this idea, and were also hungry as fuck, so Ash and the gang managed to go over to the waterfall, with Brock hoping that the waterfall may contain a secret of some sort, to make the day more interesting. Foreshadowing? Meanwhile, Team Rocket were spying on Ash and the gang as usual, planning to steal Pikachu, the most basic of basic plans. Despite this, James and Meowth were trying their best to make the plan different and interesting, but since they were spending so much time planning, they didn't notice that Jessie was eating all of their lunch, much to their goddamn dismay, as Jessie refused to explain herself as she left the bushes to go chasing after Ash and the gang to continue spying on them as they had made it to the waterfall. Meanwhile, back with Ash and the gang, still being watched by Jessie, Ash and Pikachu were very eager to get over to the river and have some lunch, so they ran ahead of Brock and Misty, although they were running so fast that they ended up tripping and sliding down a steep hill, along with Larvitar, since Larvitar was still in Ash's bag. Misty screamed at Ash while he fell, because Misty had warned Ash not to go running ahead, since the steep hills could be dangerous, and he just didn't fucking listen. Ash, Pikachu, and Larvitar's fall is eventually stopped by a rock as they run into it, though thankfully they were relatively uninjured, and Larvitar didn't even screech, even though it kinda hurt. Just then, Misty and Brock run down the hill towards Ash and realize that even though Ash had fallen, he had arrived at their destination anyways, being the waterfall. And also, of course, the river where the waterfall was located, although Brock noticed that the river was dried up, now being mostly rocks as opposed to water, and a whole bunch of Slowpoke happened to be sitting on these rocks, looking immensely tired and thirsty, which also made them depressed. Ash then noticed, as he got up from his fall, that there were also a few Slowbros there as well, not just Slowpokes. But Ash then directed his attention away from the Slowpoke and Slowbros to a rock that didn't have any Slowpoke or Slowbro on it, but rather a weird mini rock of some kind, which Brock was able to identify as a King's Rock, the same item that Ash had won at that sumo tournament and had happened to evolve Misty's Poliwhirl. Ash and the gang were obviously intrigued by this King's Rock, wondering if they could use it for anything, so they go up to it wanting to take it, only to be stopped by two people, a girl named Alice and her father, known as Professor Toulouse, as well as their Slowpoke, nicknamed Arthur. How did Ash and the gang find out their names, you may ask? Well, they instantly introduced themselves as soon as they commanded Ash and the gang to back away from the King's Rock, stating that it was apparently Slowpoke's hope for some reason. Ash and the gang didn't want to upset Professor Toulouse and Alice, so they agreed to leave it alone, as Brock thought that this would perhaps impress Alice, so he decided to try and flirt with her, only for Misty to drag him off as usual. Poor Brock, he could never find love, could he? Alice and Professor Toulouse then explained that there was a reason why they wanted no one to touch the King's Rock, explaining that there was something very important that was set to happen that was related to it soon, stating that they knew this because they were archaeologists and had been studying the area and the King's Rock for some time and knew that there was a link between the two. Ash wants to know more about what this event that was related to the King's Rock entailed, leading Alice to explain that she and her dad had been researching legends surrounding a Slowking who could help save the colony of Slowpoke, although it needed the King's Rock help them. Ash questioned why Alice and her father believed that a Slowking could save all the Slowpoke from their sadness, though Alice stopped answering questions, instructing Ash and the gang to come along with her and her father, and she would explain along the way while she took them to the area where this event related to the King's Rock and the Slowking was supposed to take place. Meanwhile, Team Rocket was still spying on Ash and the gang from some bushes, and they were now interested in capturing the King's Rock as opposed to Pikachu, since they were intrigued by the King's Rock potentially having the power to save Slowpoke somehow from their sadness. Anyways, as Ash and the gang walked to this destination that Alice and her father wanted to show them, where this event with the Slowking and King's Rock was supposed to take place. Alice thought that her slowpoke Arthur was getting tired from all the walking, but Arthur denied that, shaking its head, as Alice's father then started talking about his memories with his daughter and her slowpoke, explaining that Alice's slowpoke was her Pokemon since she was extremely small, and since the slowpoke was small. So basically they had grown up together, so they were very close. Brock was bored by the seemingly meaningless conversation, so he was looking at his surroundings, and once again noticed the dried-up river, and questioned why the river was dried up, and if it had something to do with why the slowpoke were so depressed. Because he obviously thought this, but he didn't know for sure. Alice confirmed his theory, though, explaining how the river water disappeared, admitting that it did actually used to be a large lake, not even a river, but then an earthquake happened, which caused the water level to drop. Since the earthquake opened up a fissure that drained most of the water, leaving only a river, which obviously couldn't flow fast enough to fill up an entire lake, so it left a whole bunch of dry spots, since there wasn't enough water. Basically, it was an earthquake's fault. It was because of the earthquake that the slowpoke were suffering due to barely having any water to inhabit. And this suffering was why the slowpoke needed saving from a Slowking. Ash was still curious as to why Alice and her father thought this, leading Alice's father to lead everyone to a dried-up part of the river that was dried up thanks to the earthquake that actually revealed some carvings and hieroglyphics on one of the rocks, as well as the King's Rock. So even though the earthquake was a bad thing for the slowpoke, at least it was able to reveal a potential way to save them, which was the King's Rock and these hieroglyphics, which depicted none other than Slowking. Ash did in fact see the Slowking on the hieroglyphics, but he questioned how Alice and her father were able to come to the conclusion that the Slowking was supposed to save the slowpoke, leading Alice's father to explain that he was able to identify hieroglyphics and determine what they meant, explaining that he was able to identify the hieroglyphics having a title called The Legend of Slowking, and the hieroglyphics depicted a prophecy of an event that was supposed to happen in the near future, which was the event that Alice and her father were talking about before. He then went into detail on what the hieroglyphics depicted, stating that it showed that all of the slowpoke were going to die from a lack of water in the lake. But just before they would, one of the slowpoke would be able to complete a test to receive a King's Rock and evolve into Slowking with said King's Rock, and once it was a Slowking, it would be able to save all of the other slowpoke from death by restoring the water, and therefore becoming the leader of the slowpoke and the several slowbro that were also in the river. Clarifying that this test that a slowpoke was supposed to undergo to get the King's Rock was the event that they were anticipating was going to happen today, as the slowpoke were about to die, so one of them would have to complete the test soon and reach the King's Rock. Explaining that that's why Alice and her father were so intrigued by these hieroglyphics, because they actually seemed like they were going to come true. And even Misty and Brock admitted that these hieroglyphics did seem like they would come true, since they had already managed to predict the lake drying up and the slowpoke almost dying, along with the slowbro. Speaking of slowbro, Ash questioned why it was a slowpoke that was supposed to evolve into a Slowking to save the day, when it should have been a slowbro evolving into Slowking, because, he thought that slowpoke had a regular evolutionary line, where it went from slowpoke to slowbro to Slowking. However, Alice's father clarified that slowpoke had a branched evolution, much like Gloom did, with either Vileplume or Blossom. It would evolve into a slowbro when it got a Shelder on its tail, but it would evolve into a Slowking if it got a Shelder on its tail and it held a King's Rock. Alice's father then brings Ash and the gang's attention back to the hieroglyphics once more, as he explains that he knew that the Slowking would save the slowpoke, since the last hieroglyphic depicted a slowpoke paradise, although he admitted that there was one hieroglyphic, being the one immediately before the end, that he didn't understand. Ash initially thought that it looked like a split path, before changing his mind, and realizing that it looked like a rainbow with a comb on it. Misty and Brock doubted both of Ash's guesses, assuring him that if Alice and her father couldn't figure it out, then there's no way Ash fucking could, because Alice and her father were archaeologists, while Ash was not. Just then, before Ash can argue back, Team Rocket show up in royal disguises in honor of their plan of wanting to steal the King's Rock, as they do their motto, revealing themselves, and throwing off their costumes, although Ash and the gang didn't even need Team Rocket to throw off their costumes that time, as it was already extremely obvious as to who they were. Damn, maybe they were getting better at finding out their disguises. Anyways, Team Rocket were determined to not let Ash and the gang stop them, as they spotted the King's Rock resting upon that rock, and sent out their Arbok and Weezing to go retrieve it. Alice and her father were desperate to keep the King's Rock safe, obviously, so Alice pleaded for Ash to help out, so Ash sent out his Pikachu to stop Arbok and Weezing by going for a Thunderbolt, as well as a Quick Attack. However, Pikachu wasn't able to attack, as it had to dodge Arbok's poison stings. It tried to turn this Quick Attack dodge into an actual attack, but unfortunately, Arbok was able to dodge the Quick Attack, and then slammed Pikachu with its tail, turning it into a wrap, as it wrapped up Pikachu, and went to go finish it off with Bite. Since Larvitar really cared for Pikachu, it was crying at the sight of Pikachu getting its ass kicked, and wanted to do something to help it, as it cried out in desperation, screeching, forcing Team Rocket, Arbok, and even Pikachu himself to cover their ears, along with Weezing, and Ash and the gang, Alice and her father. So this forced Arbok to release Pikachu from its wrap. Basically, everyone was affected by Larvitar's screeching, with the exception of Larvitar himself, as well as Alice's slowpoke, Arthur, who noticed that Larvitar seemed distraught, so it walked over to it while it was still screaming, and patted it on the back to comfort it, which managed to stop its crying and its screeching, cheering up Larvitar. Anyways, with Larvitar not screeching anymore, this allowed Ash and the gang, Team Rocket, Arbok, Weezing, and Pikachu to remove their hands from their ears, as Ash went up to Larvitar to hug it, happy that Larvitar was happy again, and also happy that Alice's Slowpoke was unaffected by the screech, being amazed by that and wondering why that was. Unfortunately, the screeching being gone wasn't all good, as it now allowed Team Rocket to sneak up to the King's Rock, while Ash and Pikachu were distracted with Larvitar, but Brock stepped in as he sent out his new Fortress, who used Rapid Spin to make Team Rocket fall over and trip, which made Team Rocket want to try and give up on the King's Rock and run away, but their fall had alerted Pikachu, who sent them blasting off with Thunderbolt. Alice and her father then thanked Ash and Brock for helping deal with Team Rocket so they couldn't steal the King's Rock, as they continued to wait for a Slowpoke to eventually complete the test and reach the King's Rock, although they were disappointed to find out that no Slowpoke were even attempting to reach it, and declared that the lake would fully dry up by summer, which was very fast approaching if none of the Slowpoke could get to the King's Rock. Ash reminded them that the hieroglyphics said that a time like today was the day where the Slowpoke would get the King's Rock, leading Alice's father to admit that he wasn't even entirely sure about that part of the prophecy, and was beginning to doubt if the prophecy would even come true. Brock suggested that instead of waiting for a Slowking to save them, the Slowpoke and Slowbro should just migrate to another lake, but Alice clarified that this wasn't possible since the Slowpoke were too slow, and there were too many of them to successfully migrate to another lake without losing some of the Slowpoke along the way, with Alice's father clarifying that even though he had his doubts on the prophecy, he knew that it would be the only way to save the Slowpoke. Misty had her doubts that the prophecy was real though, questioning if any Slowpoke had even attempted to get to the King's Rock at all, leading Alice's father to explain that yes, there had been plenty of Slowpoke who had tried to reach the King's Rock, but they had just failed to do so. Before Alice's father could explain why the Slowpoke were failing so much, Alice then noticed that a Slowpoke was attempting to reach the King's Rock right now. And it looked like it wasn't going to fail, as it was just making the simple journey, rock to rock, to the rock with the King's Rock on it. Just as Ash and the gang, Alice and her father, began cheering on the Slowpoke though, congratulating it for being an adventurous one, a wild Shelder then leaped out of the water and clamped onto the Slowpoke's tail, evolving it into Slowbro before it could reach the King's Rock. Disappointing Alice and her father, as Alice's father explains that this was the thing that had been stopping not just that Slowpoke from reaching the King's Rock, but all the other Slowpoke. It was the Shelder, biting onto them and evolving them into Slowbro first, preventing them from evolving into Slowking. Misty and Brock point out the reasoning for all the Slowpoke being stopped, being that they were too slow, and the Shelder were too fast for them, as they were able to very quickly jump out of the water and surprise the Slowpoke, with Alice admitting that, yes, the Shelder were extremely fast and too good for the Slowpoke. And since the Slowpoke were so slow and lazy, a lot of them didn't even see the point in trying to get to the King's Rock, because they knew the Shelder would just catch them. After seeing that fate happen to so many other Slowpoke, essentially, since the Slowpoke had saw so many of their brethren get turned into Slowbro by the Shelder, they weren't motivated to think that they could get the King's Rock either. And that's why a lot of the Slowpoke wanted the Slowbro to make the journey, just like Ash had initially suggested, but they didn't realize that Slowbro couldn't evolve into Slowking. As Alice listened to the discussion, she began to get even more sad at the fear of what would happen to all the Slowpoke if the river entirely dried up, and she began crying. When Alice's Slowpoke Arthur saw Alice cry, it obviously didn't like this, as Alice was its oldest and closest friend, so it decided to take responsibility and try and retrieve the King's Rock itself, as it began hopping across the rocks. Alice and Ash and the gang, her father, didn't initially see that Arthur was trying to get to the King's Rock, and thought that it was foolishly just trying to jump into the water, leading Alice to call back her Slowpoke with the help of Ash and the gang, although Slowpoke obviously declined, making Alice's father especially surprised, as throughout their many years of knowing each other, Arthur, Alice's Slowpoke, had never disobeyed her. This led Brock to realize that Arthur was not disobeying Alice, and was trying to stop her crying by going to retrieve the King's Rock on its own, seeing it as its duty. Brock commended this, but worried what would happen to Arthur, specifically worrying that it could end up being bitten on its tail by a Shelder and evolving into Slowbro, and Ash thought that this was going to happen as well, as he remarked that Arthur appeared to be moving way too slow and could be snuck up on by a Shelder at any moment. As if on cue, a Shelder then popped out of the water, as the other Slowpoke and Slowbro watched, and to make matters worse, a whole bunch more Shelders showed up, and they all began to corner Arthur on a rock. Ash and the gang and Alice thought it was over for Slowpoke, but even as the Shelders started launching themselves at Slowpoke, it showed surprising agility for a Slowpoke, and managed to knock them away with its tail. Ash and the gang, Alice and her father were obviously immensely impressed by this, but unfortunately, as the Slowpoke was dodging, it lost its footing and slipped in the water, falling off the rock, allowing all of the Shelder to very excitedly crowd around the Slowpoke, thinking that they could all try and munch down on its tail at once. But just then, Arthur, the Slowpoke, started using its tail as a propeller by twirling it to pick up immense speed for a Slowpoke, once again, allowing him to swim away very fast through the water away from the Shelder, and eventually manages to make it to the boulder that had the King's Rock on top of it as it climbs to the top. Just then, though, 3 Shelder caught Arthur off guard as they leaped out of the water, ambushing it and preparing to clamp down on Arthur's tail, causing Ash and the gang to scream in horror at what was about to happen, when suddenly Larvitar wanted to protect Arthur since it respected him, just like he respected Ash and Pikachu, since Arthur had took the time to come up to him and comfort him. So Larvitar wanted to repay the favor by helping Arthur by using Screech. Sure, this caused Ash and the gang and Alice and her father to cover their ears in pain, but this also caused the Shelder to cover their ears in pain, but not Arthur, since Arthur was unaffected by the Screech. So, while Ash and the gang, the Slowpoke and Slowbro, and all the Shelder covered their ears, with the Shelder also retreating under the water to escape the bad sound, this allowed Arthur to stay atop the rock in peace, to place the king's rock on top of its head, and Larvitar then stopped screaming, thinking that its job was now done. Larvitar unfortunately wasn't thinking straight, because since it stopped screeching, this allowed everyone else to stop plugging their ears, including the Shelder, as they were no longer annoyed by the sound. So, a Shelder then rose up from the water once again, and landed on Slowpoke, biting onto the king's rock, as opposed to the Slowpoke's tail. Ash and the gang, Alice and her father, initially panicked at Slowpoke being clamped upon, but they were relieved when it was the King's Rock that was clamped upon, as that was what was required for the evolution into Slowking. So therefore, Arthur evolved into the Slowking. Alice then asks Arthur if it decided to risk its life to go get the King's Rock for the sake of the other Slowpoke, and Arthur nodded, confirming the prophecy of the Savior Slowking, as Ash used his Pokedex on the Slowking to learn more about it. Because, you know, I assume he was pretty shocked to see a Slowking for the first time, because he'd run into Slowpoke and Slowbro in Kanto, but you couldn't find a Slowking in Kanto. Meanwhile, Team Rocket was back in their Meowth balloon, spying on Ash and the gang, and particularly all of the Slowpoke, Slowbro, and the new Slowking, realizing that they had missed the chance to get the King's Rock, but they didn't really care about that now, as they saw that Slowking was super rare, so they were just going to take that instead, as they threw a net down from their balloon to capture it. Without Ash and the gang even noticing their Meowth balloon yet. All they saw was a net come down to capture Slowking, although Slowking used confusion to throw the net right back at the balloon and capture the balloon so that it couldn't move, although Team Rocket were not defeated by any means. Despite being trapped in their balloon basket, as Meowth got the idea to find a way to escape the Meowth balloon, but first he had to make sure that Ash and the gang and Alice and her father couldn't interfere, so he pressed a button connected to the Meowth balloon that managed to deploy some smoke so that Ash and the gang couldn't see them as Team Rocket tried to escape the Meowth balloon. Although Meowth wasn't thinking and didn't realize that the smoke wouldn't be able to fully leave the net that the balloon was trapped in, so Team Rocket ended up just blinding themselves with the smoke as they now couldn't see anything and began to cough. And the smoke also obviously hides the Meowth balloon from view. Team Rocket were too busy coughing to use that to their advantage though, and Slowking then went in for another confusion to blow the Meowth balloon against a cliff, which they crashed into. And as a result of the balloon crashing into a cliff, Team Rocket fall out of the destroyed balloon, onto the ground. Team Rocket are already severely injured by this, but when they fell, they startled the Shelder, causing the Shelder to attack them by biting onto their asses, making Team Rocket in even more pain. Despite the pain though, Team Rocket tried their best to get back up, and were only annoyed as Wobbuffet forcibly popped out of its Pokeball. But before Jesse could recall it, Ash and Pikachu then ran up to the cliff, and Ash had Pikachu blast Team Rocket off with a Thunderbolt. How were they able to get up to the cliff so fast, you may ask? Well, let's just say that Ash was really desperate to make sure that nothing bad could happen to Slowking, since they knew that Slowking was needed to save the Slowpoke, so he was able to run extra fast and blast off those bitches. Ash and Pikachu then return over to the others, and were surprised to see that Slowking hadn't started leading the Slowpoke and Slowbro, and hadn't found a way to restore the water yet, as that's what the prophecy said would happen, specifically stating that the Slowking would lead the Slowpoke and Slowbro to paradise. Ash worried that the reason why the Slowking wasn't leading the Slowpoke and Slowbro was because it didn't know where this paradise was. Although Brock tried to reassure Ash that it looked like Slowking was finally ready to do its duties, as it had now begun instructing all the Slowpoke and Slowbro to walk towards the waterfall at the end of the river. And once they all got there, the Slowking used its psychic powers to split the waterfall into two, which revealed a cave behind the waterfall that the Slowpoke, Slowbro, and Slowking could go into. Alice's father then realized that Ash's initial assumption about the hieroglyphic that he couldn't understand was actually right. It was a split path. The split path was depicting the waterfall being split apart, and then the caves behind it, fully confirming that the Slowking prophecy was true, and the cave must lead to this paradise for the Slowpoke, Slowbro, and Slowking. Just then, Slowking began leading the Slowpoke and Slowbro finally inside the cave, with Ash and the gang, Alice and her father, following behind as well, until they all arrived at a large lake and underground forest that was very big and beautiful, with a lot of water, so the Slowpoke could live happily, along with the Slowbro and Slowking. Seeing that the Slowbro, Slowpoke, and Slowking were now living happily, Ash and the gang, Alice and her father, realized that it was now time for them to leave the Pokemon in peace and exit the cave. Slowking comes with Alice out of habit, due to Alice being its closest friend, but although Alice hesitated, as she obviously didn't want to release her Slowking, she knew that she had to, since it was Slowking's duty to stay as the Slowpoke's leader to make sure that they were safe for the rest of their lives. So with that, Alice reluctantly released her best friend into the cave. But not before Alice hugs her Slowking goodbye, and tells it to never forget her no matter what, and the Slowking promises to never forget her as it waves goodbye, walking into the cave, as Ash and the gang, Alice and her father leave, looking at Slowking behind them until they couldn't anymore, as the split waterfall then merged once again, hiding the cave. This made Alice sad at the fact that she had to leave her Slowking behind, since they had been friends since they were both young. Alice's father and Ash and the gang comforted Alice, though, with Alice's father reminding his daughter that she was very lucky that her own Slowpoke turned out to be essentially the god Slowking that all the Slowpoke would look up to, stating that it must have been because of the way that she raised her Slowpoke. And Ash and the gang note that Alice was very lucky to have a king or a leader as her loving friend, as now, even though her and Slowking were separated, Slowking could always come out of the cave if Alice required his aid. Essentially, the Slowking could not only protect the Slowpoke and Slowbro, but also her as well. Alice decides to keep in contact with her Slowking and watch over it in case it ever needed her help, knowing that Slowking would always help her if she needed his help, and she and her father then thank Ash and the gang for all their help and helping Alice come to terms with having to release her Slowking. Before Ash and the gang make their exit, Brock tries to flirt with Alice one more time, stating that he wanted to find his own paradise with Alice, just like how the Slowpoke, Slowbro, and Slowking had found their paradise. But Misty, of course, just drags Brock off as usual, as Ash and the gang say goodbye to Alice and her father and continue on their journey to Mount Silver, while Alice and her father continue to watch over the Slowpoke, Slowbro, Slowking paradise.